Maya Carter was invisible. Not because she wanted to be, but because Wellington Academy made her that way. As a scholarship student, she was an outsider in a sea of privilege. She wasn't supposed to be noticed, not supposed to belong. For years, Maya walked the halls of the prestigious school like a ghost, unnoticed and unimportant. She was the girl in the back of the classroom, the one who never raised her hand, the one who never stood out. But there was something the other students at Wellington Academy didn't know. Behind Maya's thick glasses and quiet demeanor was a mind sharp enough to cut through anything. And behind her delicate frame was a heart that had learned to take hits yet never gave up. What they failed to notice was that Maya was the granddaughter of a legend. Daniel Carter, a man whose legacy in the world of martial arts was known by few but respected by all. Her grandfather had taught her from an early age how to strike with precision, how to defend herself against an enemy but also when to hold back, when to show restraint. It was a lesson that Maya had learned well, because she understood one thing. The true strength of a warrior is not in their ability to fight, but in their ability to choose when to fight. For years, she had endured the cruelty of Samantha Brooks and her clique, Emily and Olivia always by her side, tormenting her every day. They made Maya their favorite target for bullying. They mocked her clothes, her glasses, her very presence. Maya didn't fight back. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But every insult, every nasty comment, every slap of humiliation was met with silence. Because Maya knew something they didn't. The day would come when she wouldn't have to stay silent anymore. It was just another normal day at Wellington Academy. Maya was at her locker, quietly organizing her books when she heard the snickers behind her. Samantha Brooks, the queen bee of the school, stood with her minions, Emily and Olivia, as they eyed her with condescending grins. "Look at her shoes," Samantha whispered loudly enough for Maya to hear. "Third year in a row with the same pair. You'd think scholarship kids would at least try to fit in." Maya didn't respond. She simply adjusted her thick glasses and continued with her task. Her grip on the books tightened slightly, but nothing else in her demeanor changed. She had learned long ago that responding to their taunts was what they wanted. Instead, she chose to rise above it. Later that day in history class, something happened that was so subtle, so brief, that no one noticed it except for Maya. A textbook slipped from Mr. Peterson's hands, and before it could hit the floor, Maya's hand shot out with startling speed, catching it midair. Her posture straightened, her movements precise, her reflexes lightning fast. For a brief moment, she was no longer the awkward girl they mocked. But then, like always, Maya pretended nothing had happened. She fumbled with the book and let it drop onto her desk. She could feel the eyes of Emily and Olivia on her. Their curiosity piqued. They exchanged a glance but said nothing. It was just the beginning of the shift. The halls of Wellington Academy, lined with marble and polished lockers, gleamed under the soft lighting, giving everything an aura of wealth and privilege. Students moved in packs, their positions well established. Athletes with athletes, debate team members with their own. But at the top of this social hierarchy stood Samantha Brooks, and below her, a series of loyal followers like Emily and Olivia, all carefully curated to fit her vision of what it meant to be worth something in this world. Maya Carter, however, moved through these halls unnoticed like a shadow, her head down and shoulders hunched, her body taking up as little space as possible. She was invisible to everyone but the people who had made it their life's mission to make her suffer. Samantha, ever the self-appointed ruler, had seen Maya, had noticed her, and made it her personal goal to ensure that Maya never felt welcomed. At lunch, Maya sat alone in her usual corner of the cafeteria, picking at her salad. She wasn't hungry, she never was. She couldn't stomach the way her classmates treated her. They'd already made her feel like an outsider, and now they were doing it again. Suddenly, the shadow of someone loomed over her tray. Maya looked up slowly to find Samantha standing there, flanked by Emily and Olivia. Samantha held a cup of cranberry juice in her hand, her smile sugary sweet but laced with malice. "That presentation you gave was interesting," Samantha said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. She held the cup too close to Maya's face, forcing her to look at the bright red liquid. Maya's dark eyes remained steady, wary, but she didn't say a word. Samantha stepped forward, pretending to lose her balance as she spilled the juice all over Maya's pristine white shirt. Maya sat frozen as the red stain spread across her shirt like blood, a mockery of the humiliation they had carefully orchestrated. The cafeteria erupted with laughter, echoing through the walls, each chuckle cutting deeper into Maya's heart. But she didn't move. Her fists clenched beneath the table until her knuckles turned white. But her expression remained as still as stone. She wasn't giving them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Samantha, undeterred, tossed a napkin onto the table. "Better clean up," she said, her voice casual, almost mocking. Then, with a final smirk, she turned and walked away, leaving Maya alone with the giggling crowd. But this time, something inside Maya shifted. She wasn't going to let this be another moment of silent suffering. No, this time, something had cracked. And this time, they would pay. After school, Maya walked home, taking a longer route to avoid the usual crowd of Wellington students. She passed the towering mansions that housed the other students, a stark contrast to the modest two-story home she shared with her grandfather. As she walked, the humiliation of the day gnawed at her, but she didn't let it break her. She didn't let it show. She entered the quiet house where Daniel Carter, her grandfather, sat in his worn leather armchair, reading his well-loved copy of The Art of War. At 72, he was still physically imposing, broad-shouldered and unshakably confident. He didn't look up as Maya entered, but the air in the room thickened. His awareness of her presence was palpable, even if he didn't acknowledge it with words. "You good?" he asked, his deep voice filling the space between them. Maya didn't answer right away. She set her backpack down, her gaze falling to the red stain on her shirt. But Daniel's sharp eyes caught it instantly. "Did they do it again?" he asked, his voice cool but laced with concern. Maya nodded, but instead of reacting, she went into the kitchen to start preparing dinner. She didn't want to talk about it, not yet. Her grandfather knew her well enough to let her be, and he didn't press further. He simply returned to his book, his silent understanding hanging in the air. That night, long after Daniel had gone to bed, Maya descended to the basement of their home. Unlike the modest living areas upstairs, the basement had been transformed into a training space. Mats lined the floor and various pieces of equipment filled the walls. Heavy bags, speed bags, and wooden dummies for practicing strikes. Maya changed into simple black workout clothes and wrapped her hands with practiced efficiency. As she moved to the center of the room, everything about her posture changed. Her usual slouch disappeared and the tentative movements gave way to precision. She stood tall, balanced, poised, like a fighter preparing for battle. Her first punch landed with surprising force against the heavy bag, sending it swinging on its chains. She followed with a series of strikes so fast they blurred, each landing with perfect control. For an hour, she moved in focused silence, her body revealing the years of disciplined practice she'd poured into mastering her craft. When she finally stopped, sweat glistening on her skin, she stood before the bag, breathing steadily. She wasn't the awkward, invisible girl who had walked the halls of Wellington Academy that morning. No, this was Maya Carter, the granddaughter of Daniel Carter, a woman who would soon make the world realize her strength. Later, as she stood before the bathroom mirror, Maya removed her glasses, revealing her striking features and intense dark eyes. She studied her reflection. Without the thick frames, her face was sharp, defined, full of a quiet power that she'd kept hidden for far too long. She stared at herself for a long moment before whispering to her reflection, "I'm done hiding." Amira's daily life had always been a careful balance of invisibility and survival. At Wellington Academy, she was the ghost in the halls, the overlooked scholarship student who existed in the shadow of privilege. The laughter, the whispers, the looks, they all came like clockwork, but Amira had learned long ago to suppress any reaction. She had become a master of blending in, of not drawing attention, of retreating into herself as the world continued on around her. But that day, something was different. Her breath caught in her throat as the doors to the cafeteria swung open, and Veronica's unmistakable voice cut through the chatter. Veronica was always the ringleader, the puppet master pulling the strings of her loyal followers, each one eager to please her. Amira had never been one to engage in confrontation, yet there was a flicker inside her now, something she could no longer ignore. The stain of the cranberry juice still clung to her uniform like a badge of humiliation. And for the first time, Amira let the anger simmer beneath her calm exterior. "You think you're so much better than us, don't you, Amira?" Veronica's voice was sweet, dripping with mockery. "Maybe you should just stick to your place, poor little scholarship girl, always pretending like she belongs here." Her words cut like knives, but Amira stood her ground. The others around the table laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. Madison, Bridget, they were all complicit, passive followers who reveled in the degradation of someone they deemed beneath them. But Amira didn't flinch. She simply stared at Veronica with those dark, unblinking eyes. Veronica had never seen this side of her before, the quiet girl who had always withered under her ridicule. She stopped for a moment, something flickering in her expression, but it was gone almost immediately, replaced by the ever-familiar sneer. Amira could feel the familiar pressure of their laughter, the way they all looked at her like she was beneath them. But she refused to bow her head. The paint incident at the party, the one that was meant to break her, had been the moment she realized that she was no longer afraid. The humiliation, the laughter, the taunts, they had all been part of the plan. They didn't know it, but they were pushing her closer to the edge. And soon, very soon, they would realize how wrong they were to underestimate her. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind as she walked away from the table. Mercy is a weapon, too. She had spent so long hiding, suppressing the truth of who she was, but the time for hiding was over. She had the strength now to stand tall, to fight back not with violence, but with the sheer force of her presence. Later that day, she returned to the sanctuary of her home. The small, humble house she shared with her grandfather was a far cry from the mansions of her classmates. Her grandfather, William Johnson, sat in his worn chair, a silent sentinel in the corner of the room. At 72, he was still a towering figure, his broad shoulders and the intensity in his gaze marking him as someone who had seen and done far more than most could ever imagine. Amira set down her things and walked to the kitchen, her mind buzzing with everything that had happened. Her grandfather didn't need to ask. He could read her every movement, every glance, and his quiet understanding was enough to speak volumes. She didn't even have to tell him. He could see it in her eyes. "What did they do to you this time?" His voice was low, but it carried the weight of years spent in quiet observation. Amira paused for a moment, looking at the red stain on her shirt. She had learned to hide the hurt, the anger, the frustration. But today it was different. She could feel the weight of every moment of humiliation pressing down on her. The time for hiding was over. "They think I'm weak," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "They don't know who I really am." William didn't respond at first. He simply studied her, his sharp eyes taking in every nuance of her expression. Finally, after a long silence, he nodded. "You're right, they don't know, but they will." His words were a promise, and in that moment Amira knew that her life was about to change. The world that had once felt so hostile, so unforgiving, was no longer the same. She had always been more than they saw. She had always been a fighter, and now she would make them see. The next morning, Amira walked through the halls of Wellington Academy with a sense of purpose that was almost alien to her. For years she had kept her head down, making herself small, invisible to the world around her. But today, there was a shift in her step, a subtle but undeniable confidence in the way she carried herself. She walked with her back straight, her shoulders squared, her eyes meeting the gaze of anyone who dared to look at her. She no longer feared their judgment. She no longer felt the need to shrink. Her classmates stared at her, whispers rippling through the air like a breeze. Some were confused, others intrigued, but none dared to approach. Amira could sense the change, the uncomfortable shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the ground beneath them had suddenly become unstable, the once immovable hierarchy beginning to crack. For the first time, Amira wasn't just walking through the halls as the quiet scholarship student. She was walking as someone who understood her own worth, someone who had endured the worst and was ready to claim what was hers. No one would be able to push her around anymore. No one would be able to make her feel small. Later that day, in English class, she stood in front of the room delivering a presentation on Edgar Allan Poe. As she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and confident. Nothing like the hesitant girl who had once been too afraid to even raise her hand. Her classmates listened in stunned silence, their eyes following her every word. Amira wasn't just talking about Poe's works. She was showing them something far more powerful. She was showing them who she really was. When she finished, there was a long pause before Mrs. Bennet, the teacher, gave a slow, appreciative nod. "Well done, Amira," she said, her voice warm and sincere. "You've really outdone yourself." But Veronica, sitting in the back of the room, couldn't stand it. The words stung as if they were meant to cut through the carefully constructed armor that she had built around herself. The laughter, the mocking. Veronica couldn't bear it. She needed to remind Amira who was in charge. "Is that supposed to be a presentation?" Veronica whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Maybe she should present her poor wardrobe instead. The laughter from Veronica's followers, Madison and Bridget, filled the room, but Amira didn't flinch. She stood still, her posture unwavering. Inside, the rage burned, but she let it simmer, controlled. Veronica's words were nothing but empty noise, and Amira had learned long ago that the best way to fight back was not with words, but with silence. After class, as Amira gathered her things, she caught Veronica's eye. For the first time, she didn't look away. She met her gaze with quiet defiance. The small, weak girl Veronica had tormented for years was no longer there, and Veronica saw it. The girl who had once been her favorite target, the one she could torment without consequence, was now someone she couldn't ignore. There was something in Amira's eyes that Veronica had never seen before, a strength, a quiet power that seemed to pulse beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed. Later that day, as Amira sat alone in the cafeteria, she caught sight of Veronica, Madison, and Bridget walking toward her table. Veronica's eyes were filled with something dark, something that Amira couldn't quite place. She had known this moment would come. Veronica would try to tear her down, try to remind her of her place, but Amira was ready. "Look at you, still sitting alone," Veronica said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She held a cup of cranberry juice in her hand, her eyes gleaming with something malicious. "Don't you get tired of it?" Amira remained silent, her eyes meeting Veronica's without flinching. She had learned the power of silence, the power of standing her ground without a word. And then, as if in slow motion, Veronica accidentally spilled the entire cup of juice onto Amira's white uniform. The crimson liquid spread like a stain, a blood-red reminder of the cruelty she had endured. The cafeteria erupted in laughter. It was the same game, the same humiliation that Amira had grown so used to over the years. But this time there was no rage, no tears, there was only a cold calmness, a stillness that unsettled Veronica. Amira didn't even look down at her shirt. She didn't reach for a napkin. Instead, she sat there, her fists clenched under the table, her nails digging into her palms. She felt the burn of the anger, but she kept it contained. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Veronica tossed a napkin onto the table, smirking as she walked away. But Amira didn't move. She didn't react. Instead, she sat there silently seething as her tormentors drifted away, their laughter echoing in her ears. As she sat there, the truth hit her like a lightning bolt. They thought she was weak. They thought they could break her. But they were wrong. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Later that evening, Amira found herself in the familiar sanctuary of her home. Her grandfather, William Johnson, was sitting in his favorite chair, reading a book. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He could tell by the expression on her face. Amira didn't speak, but her grandfather's eyes met hers with quiet understanding. He didn't ask her what happened. He didn't need to. He had always known. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice gentle. Amira's gaze shifted to the red stain on her shirt. Her fingers clenched into fists, but she forced herself to relax. "I'm fine," she said quietly. "I'm done pretending." Her grandfather's eyes softened. "Good," he said simply. "Now they'll see the real you." And for the first time, Amira believed it. The real Amira was about to rise, and nothing, not even Veronica Taylor and her followers, would be able to stop her. The next morning, the air at Wellington Academy was thick with tension. It wasn't just the usual buzz of teenage chatter and laughter. It was something more palpable, a shift that had occurred overnight. The students walked through the hallways with a new awareness, as if they had just realized they were living in the middle of a story that was unfolding before their eyes. Amira felt it the moment she stepped out of her car. The whispers had started, but unlike before when they were a mere hum of derision, now they carried something else, curiosity, maybe even fear. It was as if the whole school had been forced to confront the idea that she wasn't the meek, invisible girl they had once dismissed. She wasn't the paint girl or the poor scholarship kid anymore. She was someone they didn't quite understand yet. Someone they feared might be more than they could handle. She passed the lockers, the groups of students huddled together in their cliques. Veronica's usual entourage was conspicuously absent. Even Madison and Bridget didn't meet her gaze. Instead, they shifted uneasily, as if unsure of what to do with this new version of Amira. Amira wasn't looking for validation. She wasn't seeking anything from them. She just walked, her head held high, her steps slow but deliberate. She was in control now. The school may have tried to break her, but she had come out stronger. In class, it was the same. Teachers treated her differently. Some looked at her with a new respect, while others, like Mr. Peterson, who had always underestimated her, seemed to wrestle with a sense of discomfort whenever she spoke. Amira no longer allowed herself to be silenced. When she contributed to discussions, her voice was steady and clear, and her insights were profound. She had always been more than the girl they saw on the surface, but now she was showing them. Then there was the moment she had been dreading. It was lunch. Amira sat at her usual spot, tucked away in the corner of the cafeteria. She had long since learned to avoid the crowded tables where the stares and whispers would only make her feel small. But today the silence around her was different. The usual isolation had shifted into something more deliberate. The students around her, though not approaching, were watching her. That was when Veronica and her new lackeys showed up. Veronica stood there, her expression a mix of contempt and something else. Uncertainty. She had always been the queen bee, the one who ruled the cafeteria with an iron grip. But now she was just another girl standing in front of someone who had decided she was no longer going to play by her rules. "I see you've decided to start making waves," Veronica said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, the venom barely hidden behind the smile. How cute! Amira looked up, her eyes meeting Veronica's without hesitation. She didn't have to say anything, she didn't need to. Veronica's words hung in the air, weak and ineffective. You're still the same, Veronica, Amira said, her voice calm but firm. Trying to make yourself feel better by stepping on others. It's pathetic. Veronica's smile faltered. The words hit harder than she had anticipated, the sting of truth more than she could bear. Her eyes flicked to the students standing behind her, Madison and Bridget, who looked just as uncomfortable as she did. The crowd was no longer supporting her, not in the way they used to. There was a shift in the air, and even if they didn't acknowledge it, they felt it. You're still talking like you're some kind of victim, Veronica sneered, but the anger in her voice was hollow. You've made a fool of yourself, and now everyone's watching you fail. Amira didn't flinch. She just stood, letting the silence between them grow. Veronica's bravado was failing, and Amira could see it in the way her eyes shifted nervously. This wasn't the same Veronica who had held all the power before. This was someone scrambling to find her place, unsure of where she fit in anymore. You're right, Amira said softly, her words ringing clear in the quiet cafeteria. I'm not the victim anymore. You're just scared of what happens when someone like me stops letting you control the narrative. The last bit of Veronica's composure cracked. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but Amira was done. With a final glance, she turned and walked away, leaving Veronica standing there, her followers awkwardly shuffling behind her. As Amira walked out of the cafeteria, she could feel the eyes of the students on her. They were watching her with a mix of awe and fear, unsure of what to make of the new Amira. And for the first time, she didn't care. They weren't the ones who would define her anymore. That night, as she sat with her grandfather, William Johnson, in their modest living room, she couldn't help but smile. You were right, she said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. They'll never see me the same way again. William didn't answer right away. He just gave her a long look, one that spoke volumes. There was pride in his eyes, but also something more, a warning. You've shown them a side of you they didn't know existed, he said, but be careful. Not everyone will take kindly to it. The moment you stop hiding who you really are, the world will start treating you differently. And sometimes, that comes with consequences. Amira nodded. She understood what he meant, but she also knew that she couldn't go back to the way things were. The girl who had been silent, who had let herself be crushed by the weight of others' cruelty, she was gone. What was left now was someone who was ready to face whatever came next, someone who wouldn't apologize for her strength. I'm ready for whatever happens, Amira said, her voice steady. I've lived in their shadows for too long. Now it's my turn to step into the light. Her grandfather smiled, a small, proud smile. He didn't say anything more, but he didn't need to. He knew Amira had become something more than he had ever hoped for. And he knew the world had no idea what was coming for them. The following day at Wellington Academy, the weight of yesterday's exchange hung in the air like a storm cloud, though the storm itself hadn't yet broken. It was a Monday, the kind of morning that had once felt like a fresh start but now felt different, charged, full of potential and uncertainty. Amira walked through the halls with a quiet confidence that even she hadn't anticipated. She didn't hurry, her steps were deliberate, as though the ground itself recognized that she wasn't just walking through her high school anymore. She was walking through her story, her transformation. It wasn't just her body that had changed. It was the way she held herself, the way she moved through the world now. It was as if she had grown into her own skin overnight, a skin that had once been invisible but was now an armor she wore with pride. She passed by Veronica's usual spot, but the group wasn't there. Instead, she found Madison, who caught her eye. But this time there was no sneer, no discomfort. There was something else in her gaze, reluctance, maybe even guilt. The confrontation from the day before hadn't just unsettled Veronica, it had rattled the people around her as well. The aura of fear that had once clung to Veronica's followers was now beginning to shift, and Amira could see it in the way people watched her. Not with pity or mockery, but with respect, caution, and sometimes even fear. As Amira made her way to history class, her usual seat in the back corner was already taken by Madison, sitting alone. She wasn't with Veronica today. That fact wasn't lost on Amira. The battle lines, once drawn so sharply, were now less clear. Madison had been a part of Veronica's camp for years, a loyal follower, until yesterday when she had started to see the cracks in the foundation of their friendship. The cracks had widened with every word Amira had said, with every glance she had thrown toward them. "Amira," Madison said quietly when she saw her, her voice hesitant, almost apologetic. She seemed unsure of what to say or how to act. Her eyes, which used to glimmer with something closer to indifference, were now filled with a different emotion. Something closer to respect and maybe, just maybe, fear. Amira gave her a small nod but didn't say anything. She wasn't ready to engage. She wasn't sure if Madison had truly changed or if she was simply reacting to the chaos she had helped create. The truth was, Amira wasn't interested in forgiving just yet. Trust wasn't something she could give away easily, not after everything that had happened. Madison shifted in her seat, as if unsure whether to continue or not, but before she could say anything more, the teacher, Mr. Peterson, walked into the room and the moment passed. Amira took her seat, but her mind was not on the lesson. It was on the game that had shifted and how, for the first time, she was no longer the one who was powerless. The bell rang for lunch, and Amira made her way to the cafeteria. She had no intention of sitting at the usual table, but she knew something was different. As she entered the lunchroom, she couldn't help but feel the eyes on her again. But this time it wasn't derision, it was curiosity. Some students, like the girls from the debate team, still didn't quite know what to make of her. But others, those who had once laughed behind her back, were watching her with a new kind of awareness. When she finally found a spot in the back corner, away from the groups, she wasn't surprised to see Madison sitting nearby, glancing over at her occasionally. It was clear she was struggling with something, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear. But whatever it was evident that the dynamic had shifted. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Veronica was absent from most classes, her followers scattered, and the students who had once rallied around her now seemed unsure of where to place their loyalty. Veronica, who had once been the Queen of Wellington, found herself increasingly isolated, her social empire crumbling. The whispers that had started as a whisper about Amira's strength were now growing into a roar. The students, once enamored by Veronica's social dominance, were beginning to recognize the true power of someone who had been underestimated for so long. It wasn't long before the rumors spread, not the fabricated stories Veronica had tried to weave, but the real ones, the ones that came from the people who had witnessed Amira's restraint, her control, her precision. The whispers spoke of the way she had handled herself at the party, how she had walked away from humiliation with dignity. They talked about how, even in the face of adversity, she had refused to let the bullies break her spirit, and they whispered about the change that had come over her, how she had transformed from the shy girl hiding behind thick glasses into someone who commanded respect without ever asking for it. It wasn't long before the administration started to take notice. Amira's transformation didn't go unnoticed by the teachers. Some, like Mr. Peterson, who had always seemed indifferent, were now watching her with new eyes. Others, like Mrs. Bennet, who had always seen her potential, began to encourage her more actively. There was even talk among the faculty of recommending her for college scholarships. Amira's future, which had once seemed uncertain, now seemed filled with possibility. The quiet girl with the scholarship had become the student everyone wanted to know. But amid all this, Veronica had not been idle. She knew she couldn't maintain control through the usual means. She couldn't rely on her popularity or on her status as a queen bee anymore. The social order had shifted, and Veronica's carefully cultivated facade was cracking. She was losing ground, and she didn't know how to fight back. But she was determined to do whatever it took to reclaim her throne. By the time the weekend came, it was clear that Veronica was planning something. The question was whether Amira was ready to face whatever came next. Because as much as Veronica had underestimated her, Amira had learned one critical lesson. Sometimes you have to fight back, not with your fists but with your mind, and she was ready to do just that. By Monday, the tension in the air at Wellington Academy was palpable. Everyone was whispering about the paint incident, the humiliation Veronica had tried to inflict upon Amira at the party, and how Amira had handled it with a calm so unshakable it made some of her tormentors reconsider their own actions. The gossip was like wildfire, spreading through every corner of the school. Some saw Amira as a hero, the underdog who had stood her ground. Others, however, still clung to the idea that Veronica had been in control. If only because they hadn't yet realized the true power shift that had occurred. Veronica, however, was not resting. The isolation she felt was eating at her, gnawing away at the foundation of everything she had built. Her empire had started to crumble, and she wasn't about to go down without a fight. She had always been the one in control, the one who dictated who was in and who was out. But now she found herself playing catch-up. Her reputation, once unchallenged, was now a crumbling relic. She no longer held the power in Wellington's social hierarchy. Amira did, and Veronica couldn't stand it. The phone call came on Monday afternoon. Veronica's hands were shaking slightly when she picked up the receiver. It was her father, Richard Taylor. "You need to do something about this, Veronica. It's getting out of hand. The board's getting involved." Veronica could hear the weight of his words. The school was already considering action. There were whispers about possible suspension, about Amira's background, about the rumors that had been spread by her own hand. But Veronica was determined not to let the tables turn completely. She wouldn't allow Amira to ruin her. Not after everything she had worked for, not after everything she had endured to maintain her position at the top. The next morning, the assembly was called. Principal Harrington announced it over the PA system, his voice carrying the weight of what was about to unfold. It wasn't just a usual meeting. It was a meeting to address the growing tensions among students, to deal with the aftermath of the incident that had divided the school. Veronica, as always, was quick to take action. She knew this was her opportunity to turn the tide. But what she didn't anticipate was how much things had already shifted in the student body. As the students filed into the auditorium, Amira took her usual seat at the back, her eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't afraid. She had made her decision long ago. This moment wasn't about power. It was about survival. It was about making sure that the people who had tormented her would never forget who she was. Veronica, on the other hand, was restless. She paced back and forth, her nerves on edge. She had orchestrated everything so carefully, spreading rumors, twisting the narrative. But now, she was starting to feel the weight of her own lies pressing down on her. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, as though everyone had already picked sides. The whispers had started. Some were about Amira, but others were starting to circle around Veronica too. The realization was sinking in. Her days of reigning over Wellington were numbered. When the bell rang to signal the beginning of the assembly, Veronica stepped to the front, her steps filled with false confidence. She straightened her posture, putting on the mask of the leader she had once been, the queen who had controlled everything. But something felt different today. The murmurs in the crowd were louder than usual. The students weren't laughing at her jokes. They weren't even smiling. They were watching her, but not with the adoration she was used to. It was suspicion now, fear, and worst of all, resentment. Principal Harrington called the assembly to order, his voice grave as he addressed the concerns about the tension between students. "We need to come together as a community," he said, his gaze sweeping over the students. "What happened with Miss Johnson and Miss Taylor is something we will address, but I want everyone to understand that bullying, whether in the form of physical aggression or psychological manipulation, will not be tolerated here." The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at one another. This wasn't just a lecture on behavior anymore, this was a warning, a message that the school was finally acknowledging the cracks in its foundation. When it was Veronica's turn to speak, she could feel the weight of every eye on her. She cleared her throat, forcing a smile, but the words stuck in her throat. For the first time, she wasn't sure she could convince them. She had always been able to manipulate the room, to charm the crowd into submission. But now, it felt like the room was turning on her. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could utter a word, Madison stood up. The entire auditorium went silent. Madison walked slowly to the front, her face pale but her posture firm. She was no longer hiding behind Veronica's shadow. She wasn't there to support her. She was there to expose the truth. "Principal Harrington," Madison said, her voice steady, "I need to say something. Everything that's been happening with Amira. It's not her fault. It's not just Veronica's fault either. We've all been complicit in letting this happen. But I want you to know, this was all planned. It was Veronica who spread the rumors. It was Veronica who turned us all against Amira." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Veronica's heart raced. She didn't know what to say. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the podium in front of her. Madison continued. "We've watched Amira go through hell for years. She's been bullied, humiliated, and we all stood by and did nothing. I'm guilty of it too. But now we need to stop. Veronica is the one who pushed this too far. She's the one who made this personal." Veronica opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was in shock, her world unraveling before her eyes. For the first time in her life, someone had exposed her for what she really was. And the truth was sinking in. She was no longer the queen. Amira was the one who had taken back control. Amira was the one who had shown strength, real strength. And now Veronica was the one who would pay the price. The room erupted in whispers, eyes shifting from Veronica to Madison and then to Amira. The power had shifted in that room, and Veronica knew in that moment that she had lost everything. As the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, Veronica stood frozen, the weight of Madison's words sinking in like 1,000 pounds pressing down on her chest. Her world had shifted in an instant. The power she had once wielded so effortlessly, the control she had carefully cultivated, had slipped through her fingers like sand. And it was all because of one person, Amira Johnson. Amira, the girl she had tormented for years, the girl she had humiliated, the girl who had been nothing more than a target for her cruelty. And now, Amira was standing tall, her quiet strength emanating from every inch of her body. Veronica, on the other hand, was shrinking. The mask she had carefully constructed for years, of being the perfect, unshakable queen, was slipping. The cracks were visible now, and there was no hiding from it. Madison turned to face Veronica, her eyes filled with something Veronica hadn't seen in a long time. Pity. It stung. Veronica felt the tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't going to break, not in front of all these people. She had to maintain her composure. But inside, it felt like everything was falling apart. "Veronica," Madison continued, her voice softer now, "you need to understand. This isn't about you. It's about what you've done to all of us, to Amira. You've hurt people, and now you have to face the consequences. We're all tired of being your puppets, and we're done being afraid." The room was deathly silent. All eyes were on Veronica. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the judgment in their eyes. She had been the puppet master, pulling the strings of Wellington Academy's social hierarchy for so long. But now, she was the one being watched. She was the one who was vulnerable. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the edge of the podium. She had to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. The silence was deafening, and all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart in her chest. Principal Harrington stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Miss Taylor, Miss Johnson, please follow me. We'll address this in private." Veronica didn't move. Her body felt numb. She wanted to run, to escape, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She had never been in this position before, powerless, exposed, vulnerable. And it was terrifying. Amira stood there, watching her. Her dark eyes met Veronica's for the first time in what felt like forever. And there was something in those eyes, something that Veronica had never seen before. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't anger. It was something deeper, a quiet understanding, a calm certainty. Amira had known all along. She had known that Veronica's reign would come to an end. And now, in this moment, Veronica realized that it wasn't just about power. It was about respect, and Amira had earned it. The two girls locked eyes for a brief moment, and in that instant, Veronica felt the last vestiges of her control slip away. It wasn't just that Amira was stronger than her. It was that Amira had something Veronica would never have. Genuine power, born not of manipulation but of self-awareness. Amira had fought back, not with violence, but with quiet strength, and in doing so, she had broken Veronica in a way no one ever had. Amira didn't speak, she didn't need to. Her actions had already spoken louder than any words could. She turned and walked out of the auditorium, her back straight, her head held high. And as she left, Veronica felt the room shift. The students were no longer looking at her with fear or admiration. They were looking at her with something far worse: disappointment. Veronica felt a deep, gnawing emptiness in her chest. She had lost everything: the friends, the status, the power. And what was left was the harsh truth she had spent years avoiding. She was nothing without them. Principal Harrington led the girls into his office where the tension was palpable. He stood in front of them, his face hard. "I expect you both to explain what happened," he said, his voice stern but with an edge of concern. He clearly didn't know how to handle the situation. Veronica opened her mouth, but no words came out. The lies that had once rolled off her tongue with such ease now seemed hollow, empty. She had no defense, no justification. The truth had been exposed. She had been the architect of her own downfall. Amira, on the other hand, stood silently, her posture relaxed yet resolute. She didn't feel the need to defend herself. She had already done what needed to be done. "Veronica," Amira said, her voice calm and even, "you've spent so much of your life trying to control everyone around you. You made us feel small so that you could feel big, but now the truth is out. You've lost control and you'll have to live with that." The words stung, but Veronica couldn't argue with them. Amira was right. For the first time, Veronica realized how little she had actually controlled. She had been controlling nothing more than an illusion. And now, that illusion had shattered. Principal Harrington watched the exchange, clearly unsure of what to do. He had seen the way the students had turned on Veronica. He had seen the way Amira had handled herself with dignity and grace in the face of relentless bullying. He knew this wasn't just a high school drama, it was something much deeper, something that had been brewing for a long time. "We'll have to discuss this with the board," he said finally. "There will be consequences for both of you. Veronica, your actions cannot be overlooked. Amira, I appreciate your restraint, but the fact remains that this situation cannot continue." Veronica nodded numbly, her mind spinning. She wasn't sure what to expect next. She wasn't sure what her future at Wellington would look like. All she knew was that everything had changed, and no matter what happened, she would never be the same again. Amira turned to leave, her back straight and proud. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The door to Principal Harrington's office closed behind Amira with a soft click, leaving Veronica to stew in the silence. The weight of her own thoughts bore down on her, each one heavier than the last. The truth was undeniable now, laid bare for all to see. There was no escaping the reality of her actions, the cruel games she had played. And for the first time in her life, Veronica understood what it meant to truly feel powerless. As she sat there, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair, the faces of her former friends flashed through her mind. Madison, Bridget, even Ryan, who had once been her loyal enforcer. They were all gone now. They had seen her for what she really was, and it wasn't just a fall from grace, it was the complete dismantling of her entire world. Veronica's eyes burned with frustration. How could it have all fallen apart so quickly? She had been untouchable, invincible in her own mind. Yet now, she was nothing more than a shell of the person she had once been. She had been so focused on tearing others down to build herself up that she never once considered the cost. Principal Harrington cleared his throat, breaking through her reverie. "Veronica," he began, his voice still firm but cedar now, "I understand that this isn't easy for you, but you need to understand the gravity of your actions. What you've done, what you've put Amira through, cannot be dismissed. And now, we need to find a way to move forward." Veronica wanted to lash out, to scream that it wasn't her fault, that it wasn't fair. But the words wouldn't come. There was no defense. There was no excuse. Amira had finally stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had taken everything Veronica had so carefully constructed and turned it into dust. "Do you understand, Veronica?" Principal Harrington asked again, his voice laced with quiet disappointment. Veronica nodded stiffly, her gaze fixed on the floor. She didn't trust herself to speak. She didn't have the words. Her throat felt tight, her heart heavy with shame. Every ounce of pride she had once held was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. When the door to the office opened again, Veronica lifted her head. Amira stood there, her presence commanding and unwavering. She didn't look like the same girl who had been humiliated in front of the entire school. There was no trace of the victim Veronica had once tried to make her out to be. Instead, there was only a quiet, unshakable strength. Amira stepped forward, her dark eyes meeting Veronica's for the second time. This time, there was no fear, no hesitation, just a calm, unrelenting certainty. "You asked me who I really am," Amira said, her voice steady but filled with an underlying power that seemed to shake the very air. "The truth is, I'm not just the girl you've tormented for years. I'm not just the scholarship kid you mocked. I'm someone who knows exactly what they're capable of, and that's something you'll never understand." Veronica's throat constricted as the weight of Amira's words hit her. She wanted to argue. She wanted to scream, to justify herself, to explain how she had been pushed to the edge. But she couldn't. There was no defense. Amira was right, she had underestimated her, and now she was paying the price. "You'll never get away with this," Veronica whispered, though the words felt hollow. She wanted to sound confident, but the fear in her voice betrayed her. Amira's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "I already have," she replied before turning and walking out of the office, leaving Veronica behind in the overwhelming silence. As the door closed behind her, Veronica sat in stunned silence. She could still hear the echoes of Amira's words in her mind. She could still feel the weight of the shame pressing down on her chest. The truth had been exposed, and now nothing would ever be the same. Amira had won, and Veronica had lost, and deep down, she knew that the price for her actions would be much steeper than she had ever imagined. The next few days at Wellington Academy were suffocating for Veronica. The whispers, the glances, the coldness from everyone she had once considered her allies. Everything felt like a constant reminder of the power she had lost. She walked through the halls with her head down, trying to avoid eye contact, but it was no use. Everywhere she went, people were talking about her. They were talking about Amira. And slowly but surely, the narrative was changing. Veronica had become the villain in the story, while Amira had emerged as the hero. It was like the world had turned upside down. The social order that Veronica had maintained for years had shattered, and as much as she tried to hold on to what little power she had left, she could feel it slipping away. By the time the school's assembly came around, Veronica's fate was already sealed. News of her suspension had spread like wildfire. The once untouchable queen of Wellington Academy was now the subject of ridicule, her every move scrutinized by the very people who had once bowed down to her. The day of the assembly, Veronica sat in the back, her eyes focused on the floor as the principal addressed the students. She could feel the eyes of the entire school on her, but she refused to look up. She couldn't bring herself to face them. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. Amira, on the other hand, was different. She walked in like nothing had happened, her posture confident and strong. She didn't look around for approval or validation. She didn't need to. She had already proven herself. And as she sat down at the front of the room, Veronica couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. Amira had everything that Veronica had once wanted: respect, confidence, and the power that came from within. As the assembly wore on, Veronica felt a strange sense of isolation. She had been the center of attention for so long, the one everyone feared, the one everyone admired. But now she was nothing. The students didn't look at her with fear anymore. They didn't look at her at all. The principal called for a break and the students began to scatter. Veronica stayed in her seat, feeling like an outsider in her own school. And as the final bell rang, she realized that her time at Wellington had come to an end. She left the auditorium with her head held low, walking down the hall with a sense of finality. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions: humiliation, anger, confusion. But one thing was certain now. She had lost, and there was no coming back from it. But as she reached the door, she glanced up one last time. Amira was walking out, too. Her steps were steady, her face expressionless. She was the one who had emerged victorious. And as Veronica watched her leave, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of awe and envy. Amira had shown her what true power was. It wasn't about manipulating others or controlling them. It was about standing tall in the face of adversity, never letting anyone define who you were. And for the first time, Veronica understood that. It was over, and in the end, Amira had been the one who had the last laugh. Amira walked through the hallways of Wellington Academy the next day, her posture completely different from the hunching shoulders and downcast eyes that had once defined her. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Her head was held high, her gaze unwavering. Every step felt deliberate, as if she had finally come into her own, embracing a power that had once been hidden in the shadows. The whispers that followed her now were different. The mocking tones had faded, replaced by a nervous respect. The students who had once called her names, who had laughed at her, now looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear. They couldn't quite place it, but something had shifted in Amira. No longer the quiet scholarship student they could push around, she now radiated an undeniable energy, a quiet strength that seemed to settle in the very air around her. Veronica, on the other hand, had not been prepared for this. Her world was crumbling piece by piece. Every attempt to regain control felt more desperate. She had spent years at the top of the social hierarchy, and now it seemed as if that very structure was slipping through her fingers. She couldn't understand it. How had the quiet, shy girl who she had tormented for so long become so unshakable? As Amira passed Veronica in the hallway, their eyes met. For the first time, Amira didn't look away. She didn't flinch or shrink back. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, almost as if she was daring Veronica to challenge her again. Veronica, caught off guard, felt a cold wave of unease wash over her. She had never seen Amira like this before, and for the first time she wasn't sure she could predict what would happen next. Amira continued walking, her expression calm, almost serene. The students who had been watching the silent exchange shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered, some stared in stunned silence. But none of them dared to approach Amira. She had become an enigma, someone not to be messed with. By lunch, the rumors about Amira had already begun to take on a life of their own. Whispers about her sudden transformation spread like wildfire through the cafeteria. Some students speculated that she had always been hiding something, a dark secret or hidden power. Others marveled at her ability to remain calm in the face of so much ridicule. But none of them could deny that she had changed. The shy, invisible girl was gone. In her place stood someone unafraid, unbroken, and ready to face whatever came next. Veronica, sitting at her usual table with Madison and the few remaining members of her inner circle, tried to maintain her composure, but she could feel the weight of the stares on her, the whispers, the doubt. For the first time in years, she felt like the outsider. Her control was slipping, and she didn't know how to stop it. "You see her?" Madison whispered, her voice laced with unease. "She's not the same." Veronica shot her a sharp look, but inside, she couldn't help but agree. Something about Amira had shifted. It was as if the quiet girl they had all tormented had finally found her voice, and it was a voice that no one dared ignore. "I don't know what's going on with her," Veronica said, trying to sound dismissive, though her voice faltered slightly. "But it won't last. People like her, they always crack eventually." Madison wasn't so sure. She had seen the way Amira moved now, steady, sure, and with purpose. It was unsettling. For the first time, she wasn't sure if Veronica's manipulation could bring Amira down. Maybe this time it was different. Maybe, just maybe, Amira had finally come into her own. Amira, sitting at a corner table alone as usual, glanced up. She could feel the eyes on her, the way the cafeteria had fallen into a tense silence. She could hear the faint murmurs, the whispers, but she didn't let it affect her. She had been in this position before. She had been the one they overlooked, the one they mocked. But now she was no longer that person. She finished her lunch, slowly, deliberately. There was no need to rush. She was not in a hurry anymore. For the first time in years, she was at peace with herself. And that peace gave her a strength no one could take away. Later that afternoon, Amira sat in English class, listening to the teacher drone on about the symbolism in the scarlet letter. She found the lesson interesting enough, but her mind was elsewhere. She had become so accustomed to being invisible, to sitting in the background, that it still felt strange to be noticed, to be seen. But she knew it wouldn't be long before everyone in the room, and outside it, would understand exactly who she was. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a note being passed across the aisle. She glanced down at it, then up at Veronica. Their eyes locked for a brief moment, Veronica's smirk, a desperate attempt to maintain her facade of control. Amira opened the note carefully, reading the message with a slow smile curling on her lips. It was an invitation to a party, Veronica's party. The same Veronica who had tormented her for years, the one who had thrown the drink on her, who had humiliated her in front of the whole school. For a moment, Amira considered what to do. Should she go? Should she accept the olive branch Veronica was offering, or was it another trap? But as she read the message again, a thought crossed her mind. She didn't need Veronica's approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. With a small, knowing smile, Amira crumpled the note and tossed it into the trash. She wasn't interested in playing Veronica's games anymore. Veronica, watching from the back of the room, could see Amira's reaction. The smirk faltered, replaced by something deeper, a flicker of doubt, a realization that she might have lost control over Amira forever. But Veronica wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. The battle was far from over. The next day, the school buzzed with whispers. Students who had once sneered at Amira now spoke about her with a sense of awe, though not without a hint of fear. The once dismissed girl who had been the target of mockery and cruelty was now a figure of respect and unease. Veronica, who had always ruled the school with a tight grip, felt the shift in the air. She couldn't ignore it. The power that she had once wielded with ease was now slipping through her fingers, and it was terrifying. Veronica's inner circle, once unbreakable, had started to crumble. Madison, Bridget, and even the others had begun to pull away from her. It was like watching her kingdom fall apart, and she could feel the weight of it with every passing minute. The tables had turned, and Amira was no longer the quiet, overlooked scholarship student. Now she was the one who commanded attention, and it sent shivers down Veronica's spine. Amira, for her part, moved through the school with newfound confidence. Gone was the girl who had hidden behind thick glasses and oversized clothes. She stood tall, her posture straight, and her presence was commanding. She no longer cowered in the shadows. Instead, she walked through the halls with quiet grace, unbothered by the stares and whispers. Her gaze never wavered when it met Veronica's. There was no fear in her eyes anymore, only a calm certainty that Veronica had never seen before. As the days passed, Veronica's attempts to reassert her dominance grew more desperate. She spread rumors about Amira's family, painting them as dangerous criminals. She whispered about Amira's mysterious background, trying to turn the school against her again. But the more she pushed, the more the tide turned against her. The students, once loyal to Veronica, began to see her for what she truly was, a bully and a manipulator. Veronica's power was fading, and nothing she did could stop it. Her tantrums, her lies, her manipulations. Nothing worked. Amira had become a symbol of strength, and it was a symbol that no one could ignore. It was in the way she carried herself, the way she handled herself with such quiet dignity and control. The students who had once mocked her now admired her, not just for her ability to fight back, but for the way she had done it with restraint and class. The final straw came when Veronica, in one last attempt to regain control, challenged Amira directly in front of the entire school. She tried to provoke her, to get her to react, to finally break her calm demeanor. But Amira remained silent. She didn't need to say a word. She didn't need to defend herself. Veronica's words fell flat in the face of Amira's unshakable composure. And when Veronica finally lunged at her in an outburst of frustration, it was too late. Amira's response was swift, controlled, and decisive. Without hesitation, she disarmed Veronica's attack with precision, rendering her helpless in front of the entire student body. The scene was shocking, not because of the violence, but because of the calm, controlled way in which Amira had dismantled her opponent. The school, which had once been terrified of Veronica's wrath, now watched in stunned silence as she was brought low by the very person she had tormented. Veronica collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. Her earlier bravado shattered, and Amira, standing over her, didn't gloat. She didn't revel in the victory. Instead, she simply looked down at Veronica with a quiet understanding. The message was clear. She had fought back, but she had done it on her own terms. The rest of the day was a blur of whispers and stares. Veronica's fall from grace was swift and brutal. Students who had once adored her now looked at her with disdain. Teachers who had once overlooked her behavior now watched her with suspicion. Even her so-called friends had started to distance themselves. Madison, who had been Veronica's closest ally, now seemed to be avoiding her completely. And as for Amira, she simply went about her day. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't need to. She had already won. not just in the eyes of the school but in her own heart. She had proven to herself that she was more than just the quiet girl in the background. She was powerful, she was capable, and she was done hiding. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere at Wellington Academy shifted in ways that no one could have predicted. Veronica's absence from her usual social perch was palpable. But it wasn't just her former friends who felt the loss. The entire school felt it. Without Veronica's oppressive rule, the rigid social structure that had defined Wellington for years began to crumble. Students, once divided by wealth, status, and power, now interacted with a sense of fluidity and openness that had never existed before. Amira, in her newfound confidence, was no longer the invisible girl in the corner. She walked through the halls with the grace and strength of someone who had found her place, not through the approval of others, but through self-acceptance. The whispers that had once followed her were now full of respect. She had earned it, not by fighting back with aggression, but by simply being herself. Her quiet strength had spoken louder than any words ever could. One afternoon, as Amira walked through the school courtyard, a group of younger students stopped her. They had seen the videos, heard the rumors, and now they wanted to know more about the girl who had taken down the infamous Queen of Wellington. But Amira, ever the mystery, didn't offer them anything more than a polite smile. She didn't need their admiration. She didn't need anyone's approval. Her thoughts, however, were not entirely focused on the students around her. She couldn't shake the growing sense of unease in her gut, the knowledge that this was only the beginning. Her fight at Wellington had been a personal one, but there was a larger world out there, one that had been watching her closely. Her grandfather's warnings echoed in her mind. Once you show them who you really are, there's no going back. That evening, as she sat in the quiet of her room, Amira reflected on everything that had happened. She had spent so many years hiding, behind her glasses, behind her quiet nature, behind the image of the meek scholarship student. Now that image was shattered, and she was left with the raw, unfiltered truth of who she had become. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was her grandfather, William Johnson. He stepped into the room, his presence as commanding as ever. "You've done well, Amira," he said, his voice low and steady. "But you know this isn't over. What you did at Wellington was necessary, but it was only the first step." Amira nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. This wasn't just about taking down one bully, it was about something much bigger. Her legacy, her true legacy, was just beginning to take shape. "I know," she replied, her voice calm but with an edge of determination. "I've been playing by everyone else's rules for too long. Now it's my turn." William studied her for a long moment, as if weighing her every word. Finally, he spoke again. "You've been trained for this. But remember, true power isn't just about physical strength. It's about knowing when to fight, when to hold back, and when to let your actions speak louder than your words. There's a world out there that's going to test you. The people who see you as a threat, they'll never stop watching. You need to be prepared for that." Amira looked up at him, her eyes steady. "I am," she said firmly. "I've always been ready." The next morning, as Amira walked into Wellington Academy for what would be her final day there, she knew it would be different. She wasn't just leaving behind a chapter of her life. She was closing a door to a world that had tried to define her in ways she never accepted. But now she was free. And that freedom, that power, was something no one could take away from her. The school day passed in a blur of final interactions. Teachers who nodded with newfound respect, students who offered smiles and quiet nods. But no one dared approach her too closely. It was as if they all understood that the girl who had once been invisible was now untouchable. She had risen above it all, and she wasn't looking back. As the bell rang for the final time, marking the end of her time at Wellington, Amira stood in the courtyard, her gaze sweeping over the now quiet school grounds. The shadows of the past were fading, and in their place something stronger, something more resilient was emerging. And though she knew the challenges ahead would be unlike anything she had faced before, Amira was ready to confront whatever came next with the same calm, unshakable strength that had carried her through this battle. The world, she realized, was hers for the taking. It was time to embrace her legacy, and with it, she would change everything. Amira's journey, however, was far from over. As she left Wellington Academy behind, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows of her past would follow her. The attention she had drawn, the whispers, the rumors, they had all solidified her place in a much larger narrative than she had ever imagined. Weeks later, in the quiet of her room, Amira sat before a letter that had arrived for her, its seal unfamiliar. She opened it carefully, unfolding the crisp paper to reveal its contents. The message was brief but powerful. The circle is watching. They have been for some time. It's time to see if you're ready. She had heard of the circle, the whispered name for an elite network of fighters, a hidden world of power, skill, and legacy. Her grandfather had trained not only her, but had once been part of this very world. A world that operated outside the laws, a world where power wasn't just a privilege, it was a weapon. Amira didn't flinch when she read those words. She knew they would come for her eventually. It was inevitable. All the skills, the years of training, everything had led to this moment. But now she wasn't just the granddaughter of a fighter. She was a force in her own right. The next morning she sat down with her grandfather, her thoughts heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. "What does this mean?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. William Johnson, her rock, her mentor, looked at her with a quiet understanding in his eyes. He had always known this day would come. "It means they know you," he said, "and they want to see if you're worthy to join them. They've been waiting for the right moment, your moment. You're ready, Amira, but you have to decide if this is the path you want." Amira took a deep breath. She had never been one to shy away from a challenge, and this one, the one her grandfather had warned her about, seemed to be a culmination of everything she had endured. It was a test, not just of her skill, but of her very soul. "I'm ready," she replied. "I've always been ready." William nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Then let's see if the circle agrees." The months that followed were a blur of rigorous training, both physical and mental. Amira spent long hours in the gym, perfecting her techniques, honing her mind, sharpening her ability to read people and situations. She was no longer just a fighter, she was becoming something more. Something beyond the confines of Wellington Academy, beyond the confines of her old life. But the more she trained, the more she realized the true weight of the choice she had made. This world was dangerous, its stakes were high, and the consequences of failure were dire. The circle wasn't just an organization. It was a way of life, a code of power that had shaped countless lives, including her family's. The question now was whether she would bend to their will, or if she could carve her own path. One evening, her grandfather took her to a secluded part of the city. It was dark, the streets empty except for a few scattered figures who moved in the shadows like specters. "This is it," William said quietly as they stood before an unmarked door in the middle of an alley. "The circle's invitation is not one you refuse, but it's not just about being invited in. It's about what happens once you're inside. You have to be prepared for what they'll demand of you." Amira nodded, her heart beating a little faster now. She wasn't afraid. She had faced her fears before, but this felt different. This was a moment that would define her future. She knocked on the door. A moment later it opened, revealing a man dressed in black, his face hidden behind a mask. "Amira Johnson," the man said, his voice low and impersonal. "You've been chosen. Follow me." She stepped inside, leaving the world she had known behind her. The door closed silently behind her, sealing her fate. Inside the building, the air was thick with tension. The room was dimly lit, and as Amira walked further in, she saw figures sitting in shadows, their faces obscured. This was the Circle, the hidden force that had watched her, waited for her to prove herself. She didn't wait for them to speak. She knew what was expected. She had already proven herself in more ways than they could understand. "I'm here," she said, her voice carrying with it the weight of everything she had gone through. "And I'm not just here to be tested. I'm here to take my place." There was silence for a long moment, and then one of the figures leaned forward. "You're confident," he said, his tone amused. "But confidence alone doesn't make you worthy of the Circle. You have to show us more than that." Amira's eyes narrowed, her posture rigid. "I've already shown you everything you need to see," she replied. "I've fought for my place and I've earned it." The room fell silent once more, but this time, Amira didn't back down. She stood tall, facing them, her mind clear. She wasn't the same girl who had walked into Wellington Academy all those years ago. She had become something stronger, something more dangerous. A slow, deliberate clap broke the silence, and a figure in the shadows stood. "Then prove it," the man said, stepping forward, his face still hidden. "You've earned your place, Amira Johnson, but now you must prove that you can handle the power that comes with it, and that means facing the most difficult challenge of all." Amira didn't flinch. She was ready, and whatever they threw at her, she would meet it head on. Just as she always had. Her journey was far from over, but now she would write her own story. One where she no longer hid, where she stood tall, not just as a fighter, but as a force that could never be silenced. The Circle was waiting, and so was her legacy. Amira entered the school gates the next morning, her head held high, but her heart was a storm. Whispers and stares followed her every step, but she moved through them as if they didn't exist, focusing on the horizon. For years, she had lived as the invisible target of the elite, quietly enduring their cruelty and their snide remarks. But now, the weight of her newfound strength was something she could not hide. As she walked into the cafeteria, all eyes were on her. The same students who had once laughed at her, ignored her, or ridiculed her for everything from her clothes to her silence now stared in disbelief. It was as if a new force had descended on the school, and they didn't know whether to fear it or admire it. At her usual table, Veronica sat with her followers, her face twisted in a look of disbelief. "What is she doing here?" Veronica muttered under her breath, her eyes darting around to gauge the reaction of the others. The usual smugness in her tone was gone, replaced with a hint of insecurity. The image of Amira, calm, poised, and no longer the timid scholarship student they had once tormented, unsettled her. Amira sat alone, her gaze steady as she opened her lunch. It was the first time in years that she had taken a moment to herself without worrying about the bullies. Veronica, unable to hold back her frustration, stood up and walked towards Amira. "So, paint girl," she said, the fake sweetness in her voice barely hiding the tension beneath it. "Enjoying the attention?" Amira raised an eyebrow but said nothing, her calm presence radiating more power than any response could. Veronica's words seemed to hang in the air, trying to provoke a reaction, but Amira remained unshaken. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Veronica sneered, stepping closer, determined to reclaim the power she once held. Amira finally spoke, her voice quiet but unyielding. "I don't need your approval, Veronica. You were never my judge." The words hit harder than any of the insults she'd endured before. Veronica flinched, and the air between them shifted. The room grew quiet, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. Before Veronica could respond, the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Amira stood up, her movements graceful, effortless, and, for the first time, without hesitation. As she walked away, the whispers grew louder, but they didn't touch her. The power dynamics in Wellington had started to shift, and Veronica could feel it deep in her bones. After school, Amira walked home as usual, but her mind was elsewhere. The encounter with Veronica had been the catalyst. Something had changed. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living with a strength she had never shown before. She had finally embraced the person she had hidden for so long. When she arrived home, her grandfather, William, was waiting for her in his chair, a quiet observer of her journey. He didn't need to ask how her day had gone. He could see it in her eyes. "How did it feel?" he asked, his voice low but knowing. Amira sat beside him, still processing the day's events. "I felt powerful," she said softly, her hands tightening around the armrest. "For the first time, I didn't feel afraid." William nodded approvingly. "You've come a long way, Amira. But remember, the path you walk now won't be easy. People will fear what they can't control." Amira's eyes hardened. "Let them. It's time they learned who I really am." Amira woke up the next morning with a quiet resolve. Her every step felt calculated, deliberate. The whispers that had followed her the day before, they would only grow louder today, but she wouldn't shrink away. She was done hiding, done being the victim. At school, the atmosphere was charged. The students moved with a quiet tension, the power dynamics in their little world shifting under their feet. As Amira walked through the halls, she could feel the eyes on her. But instead of the familiar sting of humiliation, she felt calm. She was the one in control now. Veronica tried to act as if nothing had changed, but the doubt in her eyes was impossible to miss. Amira noticed it when she passed by Veronica's usual group. Veronica didn't make a snide remark or throw a taunt her way. Instead, she glared, but it was weak. The unease was clear, her attempts at dominance now a farce. In class, Amira sat in her usual seat, but this time her presence was undeniable. When she answered a question, her voice was clear, her words precise. No longer hesitant, no longer afraid to show what she knew. It felt like a victory in itself. Every time she spoke, the power shifted. At lunch, it was the same story. Amira sat alone, and this time the silence that filled the room wasn't from mockery or bullying. It was respect. She could feel the weight of it, the way the other students looked at her, not with pity or cruelty, but with something resembling awe. Veronica, for all her attempts to remain the Queen of Wellington, was slipping. Her usual group was growing smaller by the day. People were beginning to see her for what she really was, a bully hiding behind a mask of confidence. But that mask was cracking, and Amira, once the invisible one, was watching it happen. The change wasn't immediate. Veronica still tried to hold on to her social power, still attempted to manipulate her inner circle, but the energy around her was different. Her words no longer carried the weight they once did. Amira had become the center of the attention, and even though she never sought it, she was no longer willing to let anyone take it away. It all came to a head one afternoon. Veronica, growing desperate, cornered Amira in the hallway. Her followers lurking behind her, ready to witness the final showdown. "You think you've won?" Veronica sneered, her voice shaking with frustration. "You're nothing but a nobody who got lucky." Amira didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She was no longer the person Veronica had tormented for so long. She had stepped into her power. "I'm not the one who's afraid anymore," she said softly, her eyes never leaving Veronica's. The crowd that had gathered began to murmur, sensing the shift in power. Veronica's followers exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. They had followed her for so long, but now the very foundation of that loyalty was crumbling. "You're pathetic," Veronica hissed, but the venom in her voice was empty. Amira stood firm, her back straight, her eyes cold with a quiet strength. "You're right," Amira said, her tone smooth and calm. "I was pathetic. But now you see the truth. I'm not afraid of you anymore." With those words, Amira walked away. Veronica didn't move. Her followers stayed rooted to the spot as if frozen in time. The dynamic had shifted, and Veronica couldn't deny it. The following week was a blur of new realities. Veronica's power at Wellington had diminished significantly. She couldn't control the students anymore. They were no longer afraid of her. Some had even begun to rally behind Amira, whispering about her strength and resilience, praising her for standing up for herself. But it wasn't just about school anymore. It was about reclaiming herself, reclaiming her space in the world. Every day, Amira grew more confident, more certain of who she was and what she could achieve. One afternoon after school, Amira sat in her grandfather's chair, reflecting on how far she had come. William walked in, his eyes soft with approval. "You've come a long way," he said, sitting beside her. Amira smiled, the weight of years of pain lifting from her shoulders. "It's just the beginning, Grandpa. There's more to this story." Her grandfather nodded. "I've always known you had it in you. The world will see what you're capable of. But remember this, power isn't about forcing others to bend to your will. It's about choosing when to fight and when to walk away." Amira looked at him, her eyes bright with understanding. "I'm not done yet, Grandpa. Not by a long shot." As she stood up, ready to face whatever came next, she felt a sense of peace. She had found herself, and no one could take that away from her. The battle for her future had just begun, and she was ready to take on the world. Amira's resolve deepened with each passing day. Wellington Academy, once a place of torment, now felt like a battleground on which she had already claimed victory. She walked through the halls, no longer hiding in the shadows, her posture straight, her gaze unyielding. The same students who once whispered behind her back now stepped aside when she approached, their murmurs filled with awe and, in some cases, fear. Amira could feel the shift. She was no longer the hunted, she was the hunter. Veronica's downfall, though gradual, was a sight to behold. Once a figure of power and manipulation, she now moved through the school with a noticeable distance between her and her former followers. The once loyal group who had hung on her every word was now fractured, with some daring to stand by Amira, quietly recognizing the strength she had always hidden. But Veronica wasn't ready to relinquish her crown just yet. The sting of losing control ate away at her, festering in the pit of her stomach. She tried to regain some semblance of power, attempting to charm, manipulate, and humiliate Amira in front of the student body. But every attempt was futile. Amira's cool composure only made Veronica's desperation more apparent. One afternoon, Veronica's resolve reached its peak. She cornered Amira in the school courtyard, her eyes burning with fury. "You think you've won, don't you?" Veronica sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "But this isn't over. You're nothing. A scholarship kid who thinks she's something special. But you'll never be one of them. You'll always be beneath me." Amira didn't flinch. Her expression remained calm, almost serene as she looked Veronica dead in the eye. "I don't need to be one of them," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I've never needed to be. But you've needed to make everyone else feel small just to feel powerful. And now the world can see the truth." Veronica's face twisted in rage. "You'll regret this," she hissed, stepping closer. But Amira was ready. With a fluid motion, Amira stepped to the side, her body effortlessly evading Veronica's angry lunge. Veronica stumbled forward, her momentum carrying her off balance. Amira's gaze was steady, her movements slow but deliberate as she watched Veronica's desperation unfold. The crowd had gathered, drawn by the tension in the air. They watched in silence, unsure of what to expect, but Amira wasn't here to fight. She wasn't here to prove herself to anyone. She simply stood there, her presence commanding the space around her. "You're pathetic," Veronica spat, her words shaky. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Amira met her gaze, her eyes unwavering. "No," she said, her voice calm and clear. I don't think I'm better than you. I'm just done being your victim." The crowd fell into an eerie silence. For the first time in years, Veronica felt a chill run down her spine, a feeling she had never experienced before. She had no control over the situation. She had no power. Amira turned on her heel, her back straight, and walked away, leaving Veronica seething in the middle of the courtyard. The students who had once feared Veronica now watched her with pity, their respect now squarely placed on Amira's shoulders. The rumors began to spread quickly, and soon the entire school was buzzing with tales of Amira's quiet strength, her unflinching resolve. Veronica, once the Queen of Wellington, had been dethroned. The whispers that followed her now were filled with judgment, not admiration. She had been exposed not as the queen she once believed herself to be, but as a cruel, desperate woman who had lost control of everything she once held dear. As the days passed, the power dynamics at Wellington shifted. No longer did the students cower in fear of the social hierarchy Veronica had built. They began to see beyond the surface, recognizing the courage it took to rise above cruelty and oppression. And Amira? She became a symbol of strength and justice, a force to be reckoned with. Veronica's final act of desperation came during an assembly where she stood before the entire school, her hands shaking with anger. She tried to cast Amira in a negative light, desperately attempting to regain the power she had lost. "Amira Johnson is dangerous," she declared, her voice trembling. "She's hiding something. Her family. They're not who they say they are. Don't trust her. She's not one of us." But before she could say more, the students started to murmur, their attention shifting. Amira, sitting quietly at the back of the auditorium, stood up slowly. With a deliberate calm, she walked toward the front of the room. Veronica's words faltered as Amira approached. The air seemed to crackle with tension. Amira's gaze was steady, unwavering, as she reached the stage and stood in front of Veronica. She didn't say a word. Instead, she held up a single piece of paper, an invitation to a new beginning, an invitation that told the world she had nothing to hide. Veronica's face paled as the reality of the situation hit her. Amira wasn't here to destroy her. She wasn't here to humiliate her. She had already done that herself. Amira was simply walking away from the game Veronica had tried to play. And so the story of Amira's rise continued, not through confrontation, but through grace, through strength, through a quiet, undeniable power that spoke louder than any words ever could. As the weeks went by, Veronica was left with nothing but her regrets. Her former followers had abandoned her. Her social status had crumbled to dust. And Amira? She moved forward unfazed. The school, once governed by fear and manipulation, had been reborn. The lessons of respect, strength, and justice were now the foundation of Wellington Academy. And Amira, having found herself, was ready to take on whatever the future held. The world was hers for the taking, and she would never let anyone take that away from her again. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere at Wellington Academy shifted drastically. The students who had once bowed to Veronica's every command now observed her with a mix of pity and contempt. Whispers about her defeat at the hands of Amira echoed through the halls, spreading faster than wildfire. The narrative had changed. Veronica, once the queen of the school, was now a cautionary tale. Her reign of terror ended by the quiet, unnoticed girl she had relentlessly tormented. Amira, on the other hand, stood tall amidst the storm. She walked through the hallways with a newfound confidence, no longer shying away from attention or hiding in the shadows. The weight of her past struggles no longer burdened her. Her strength, both physical and emotional, radiated in every step she took. It was no longer just about survival. It was about thriving. Her presence was felt everywhere. Teachers who had once overlooked her potential now looked at her with newfound respect. They invited her to share her insights in class discussions, and she delivered them with an ease that left her peers in awe. Her intelligence and quiet strength began to shine through in ways they never had before. The girl who had once been a target for ridicule had become a symbol of resilience and justice. And yet, even as her star rose, Amira kept to herself. She had no interest in the superficial friendships that had once defined her life. Her past experiences had taught her that loyalty could be as fleeting as the seasons, and she had learned to value herself above all else. But there was still something lurking beneath the surface, a sense of justice that she couldn't ignore. Veronica's actions had hurt not just her, but countless others who had been too afraid to speak up. It wasn't enough for Amira to simply rise above the bullying. She needed to ensure that Veronica's cruelty didn't go unpunished. So, when Veronica's fate was finally sealed with her suspension from Wellington, Amira knew that it was time for her to take action. The school had failed to hold Veronica accountable for the years of torment she had caused, but Amira wasn't about to let her slip away unnoticed. Amira took it upon herself to expose the truth about Veronica's reign of terror, reaching out to the students who had suffered in silence. Together they gathered evidence, testimonials, and stories from those whose lives had been touched by Veronica's cruelty. It was time for the world to see what lay behind the polished facade of a popular girl. Time to show the world the truth about Veronica Taylor. The day came when Amira stood before the student body, her voice unwavering as she spoke of the years of abuse and manipulation. She didn't do it out of anger or revenge, but out of a sense of justice. Her words rang through the auditorium, a stark contrast to the lies and falsehoods Veronica had spun over the years. As the truth came to light, the once glamorous world Veronica had built crumbled around her. Her friends abandoned her one by one. The lies she had spread were exposed, and the truth, as painful as it was, set the stage for Amira's final act of justice. Veronica, unable to hide from the reality of her actions, found herself at the mercy of the very people she had once tormented. The shame that had followed her through the halls now weighed heavy on her shoulders. She was no longer the queen of Wellington Academy. She was a broken, isolated girl who had lost everything she had once held dear. As the story of Amira's rise to power spread beyond the walls of Wellington, it became a symbol of triumph, a reminder that justice would always find a way, no matter how deeply buried the truth might be. And for those who had ever felt small, overlooked, or defeated, Amira's story was a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of resilience, strength, and the unwavering pursuit of what was right. The world had seen the rise of Amira Johnson, and now the world would never forget.